I still develop film, not professionally, not for anyone. I do it in a closet I converted in my apartment, with a red safe light and 3 plastic trays I bought at a yard sale. I do it because the smell of fixer keeps me honest. It reminds me that some chemicals only work in the dark, and some images only exist because someone stood in a room and waited for them to appear. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that I know how photography works. I know what developer does. I know what stop bath does. I know what fixer does. I know how long it takes for an image to surface in a tray of liquid at 68 degrees. I know that paper doesn't move. I know that negatives don't change after they've been exposed. I know that a photograph is a record of light that existed at a specific moment, and once that moment passes, no new light can enter the image. I know all of this, and I know what I saw in that lab. The job was at a commercial photo processing facility about 40 minutes southeast of Tulsa, in a part of Rogers County where the land flattens out and the buildings get low and plain. The facility had been built in 1987 as part of a regional chain called Mid-South Imaging, which handled overflow processing for drugstores, portrait studios, school photography companies, and a few municipal contracts. By the time I got there, Mid-South had been defunct for over a decade. The building had been purchased by a private owner whose name I never learned, and it operated under a plain business license as a bonded document imaging service. No website, no signage except a unit number on the door. The only reason I found the listing was because it was posted on a workforce board at the county employment office, handwritten on a 3x5 index card pinned to the corkboard near the bathroom. The card said, "Overnight imaging monitor, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. No experience required. $19 per hour cash. Bring your own food." There was a phone number. I called it from the parking lot. A woman answered, gave me the address, and told me to come that night. She asked if I had a problem being alone in a building for 8 hours. I said no. She asked if I had experience with photographic materials. I told her I'd done darkroom work in community college and still processed my own black and white film at home. There was a pause. Then she said, "That's more than the last 4. Don't touch any chemistry you don't recognize." I should have heard that differently than I did. I'd been out of steady work for almost 5 months. Not because I couldn't work. I'd spent 11 years in light industrial jobs, warehouse coordination, inventory management, the kind of work where you learn systems fast and keep your head down. But the plant I'd been at in Claremore closed its second shift in March, and everything I applied for after that either ghosted me or offered $9 an hour for something that would have destroyed my knees. I had a daughter in 8th grade, an ex-wife who was remarried and stable but expected her support checks on time, and a landlord who had already given me one extension I hadn't asked for and wouldn't give me another. $19 an hour, cash, overnight, no experience required. I didn't care what the building looked like. I didn't care what I'd be monitoring. I needed the money, and I needed it that week. The building was in a small commercial park off a county road, 4 units in a long cinder block rectangle, each with a steel door and a unit number stenciled in white paint. Unit 3, no windows on the front, a gravel lot with one sodium vapor light that buzzed and flickered in a slow rhythm, like it was breathing through a filter. I parked next to a dumpster and walked to the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air hit me first, cool, chemical, and faintly sweet, the unmistakable smell of photographic fixer, but layered under something older, something like the inside of a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. The front area was a small reception space with a laminate counter, a metal stool, and a cork message board with nothing pinned to it. Behind the counter, a short hallway led deeper into the building. The hallway had 3 doors on the left, one on the right, and ended at a heavier door with a push bar. On the counter, there was a manila envelope with my name on it, first name only, spelled correctly. I hadn't given the woman my name on the phone. She hadn't asked. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 items, a single sheet of white paper with typed instructions, and a key on a plain steel ring with no label. The instructions were formatted simply. No header, no logo, no date, just a numbered list, single-spaced, in a serif font that looked like it had come from a typewriter, not a printer. The sheet read, 1. Your shift is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Do not arrive before 9:45 p.m. Do not remain past 6:15 a.m. The building's processing cycle is calibrated to these hours. Your presence outside this window will be recorded as participation rather than observation. 2. The main processing room is through the door at the end of the hallway. You may enter it at any time during your shift. The 3 rooms on the left side of the hallway are chemical storage, a utility closet, and a secondary darkroom. You may open any of these doors, but do not enter the secondary darkroom, third door left, between 12:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. 3. The processing room contains 6 enlarger stations, 4 developing baths, a drying rack system, and a motorized print conveyor. Some of this equipment will activate during your shift. This is automated. Do not interfere with any machine that starts on its own. 4. If a print appears in any developing bath, allow it to complete its cycle. Do not remove it early. Do not examine it while it is still in the developer. You may examine prints only after they have moved to the fixer bath and remained there for a minimum of 3 minutes. 5. You will find a camera on a tripod in the processing room. It is loaded. Do not touch it. Do not move it. Do not look through the viewfinder. If the shutter fires during your shift, note the time in the logbook on the counter. Do not attempt to identify what it photographed. 6. Between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., the print conveyor may produce finished prints. Collect each print as it exits the conveyor and place it face down in the output tray on the east wall. Do not look at the image side of any print produced during this window. After 4 a.m., you may examine any prints remaining in the output tray. 7. The key unlocks the filing room first door on the right side of the hallway. You are permitted to enter the filing room at any time, but do not remove any file from the building. You may read anything inside the room. 8. If you hear the sound of running water from the secondary darkroom while it is closed, do not open the door. The sound is part of the processing cycle. It is not a malfunction. 9. There is a logbook on the front counter. Log your arrival time, any equipment activations you observe, any prints produced, and your departure time. Write clearly. Use only the pen attached to the logbook. Do not use your own pen or pencil anywhere inside the building. 10. Do not correct the logbook. If you find entries you did not write, record them as observed, but do not alter, cross out, or annotate them. The logbook is a sequential document. Every entry is permanent. I read the list twice. The instructions were strange, but they were specific enough to feel procedural rather than theatrical. I'd worked jobs with unusual protocols before. Chemical handling at the plant had its own strange rituals, timed sequences, things you weren't supposed to touch during certain phases. This felt similar, almost. The thing that unsettled me wasn't any single rule. It was the gap between what the rules described and what should have been happening in a building like this. Photo processing is not automated in the way these instructions implied. Enlargers don't run themselves. Developing baths don't fill and cycle without someone mixing chemistry and setting timers. Print conveyors don't produce output without negatives being fed into them. The rules described a building that was doing its own work. I set the envelope down, pocketed the key, and checked my watch. It was 9:52 p.m. I decided to walk the hallway before my shift officially started. The first door on the left opened to a chemical storage room. Metal shelving lined 3 walls, holding brown glass bottles, plastic jugs of what looked like pre-mixed developer and fixer, and sealed containers with labels I didn't recognize. The brands were wrong, not Kodak, not Ilford, not any manufacturer I'd seen in a catalog or a supply house. The labels were plain white with black text. Standard Developer Series D, Fixer Concentrate Series F, Wash Agent Series W. No manufacturer name. No safety data sheet, no batch numbers, just the series letter and a 6-digit number that didn't correspond to any dating system I could identify. The second door was a utility closet. Mop, bucket, a circuit breaker panel, nothing unusual. The third door on the left, the secondary darkroom, was closed. I put my hand on the knob. It was cold. Not cool the way interior metal gets in an air-conditioned building. Cold like it had been sitting outside in November. I let go and moved on. It was 9:56 p.m. The restricted window for that room was 12:30 to 3 a.m. I had hours before it mattered, but I didn't open it. The door on the right had a deadbolt that matched my key. I unlocked it and pushed it open. The filing room was smaller than I expected, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with metal shelving on every wall and a narrow standing height table in the center. The shelves held file folders, hundreds of them. They were organized not by name or date, but by a numbering system printed on the tabs. 3 digits, a dash, then 2 letters. 001-PA, 002-TL, 003-RK. The sequence continued across every shelf, wrapping the room. The highest number I could see from the doorway was somewhere in the 400s. Each folder was a standard manila file, but heavier than it should have been. I pulled 001-PA from the shelf. Inside was a single photograph, an 8x10 black and white print on fiber-based paper, the kind that curls slightly at the edges when it dries. The print showed a man sitting in a chair. He was in a room I didn't recognize, looking slightly to the left of the camera, his expression neutral but specific, not posed, not candid, somewhere between like he'd been told to sit and then forgotten he was being watched. Behind the photograph was a single sheet of paper with typed information, a name, a date range, a series of numbers I didn't understand, and at the bottom, a single line that read, "Processing complete, filed." I put it back. I pulled 002-TL. Same structure, different person, a woman, younger, same neutral but specific expression, same typed sheet, same final line. I checked 003-RK, 004-DG, 005-MB. All the same, a photograph, a sheet, processing complete, filed. I didn't count how many folders were in the room. I didn't have to. The shelves went floor to ceiling on every wall, and the numbering was sequential. Whatever this system was, it had been operating for a long time. I locked the filing room and walked to the end of the hallway. The heavy door with the push bar opened into the main processing room, and when I stepped inside, I understood why the building smelled the way it did. The room was large, maybe 30 by 40 feet, and it was a fully equipped photo lab, laid out the way a professional darkroom would be if you scaled it up to industrial size. 6 enlarger stations lined the south wall, each one bolted to a heavy table with a baseboard and an easel. 4 developing baths sat in a row along the north wall. Stainless steel tanks set into a continuous counter with running water channels between them. A drying rack system hung from the ceiling on a motorized track, the kind that moves prints through warm air in a slow loop. And at the far end of the room, a print conveyor, a belt-fed machine with a slot at one end and an output tray at the other, sat against the east wall, silent and dark. In the center of the room, slightly off to one side, was a camera on a tripod. It was a medium format body, something like a Mamiya or a Bronica, though the brand markings had been removed or worn away. The lens was uncapped. The camera was aimed at an empty wooden chair positioned about 8 feet in front of it, against a plain gray backdrop that had been mounted to the wall. The chair was old, oak maybe, straight-backed, no cushion. The kind of chair you'd find in a schoolhouse from the 1940s. It sat under a single overhead light that was off. I looked at the camera. The viewfinder was at the top, angled down the way waist-level finders are. Rule 5 said not to look through it. I didn't. But I noticed the film advance lever was cocked. The camera was loaded and ready to fire. At 10 p.m. exactly, the fluorescent lights in the processing room hummed and brightened by a barely perceptible degree. The drying rack motor clicked on and began its slow rotation, empty clips moving in a continuous oval loop overhead. one of the developing baths. The second from the left began to fill. I could hear the liquid rising, though no faucet was running. The chemistry simply appeared, level climbing smoothly until the bath was full. The logbook was on the front counter, as described. It was a hardcover composition book, black, with a plain cover, no markings except a small silver triangle embossed on the lower right corner. A black pen was attached to the spine by a short cord. I opened it to the first blank page. The pages before it were filled with entries in different handwriting, dozens of them. Each entry followed the same format: date, arrival time, equipment activations observed, prints produced, departure time. Some entries had notes in the margins. Most didn't. I wrote my arrival time, 10 p.m. I noted the drying rack activation and the bath filling. I wrote clearly, the way the instructions said. Then I sat on the metal stool behind the counter, and I waited. At 10:34 p.m., the camera fired. The shutter sound was distinct, a heavy mechanical clack that echoed through the hallway and reached me at the counter. I stood up, walked to the processing room, and looked in. The camera was in the same position. The film advance lever had reset. The chair in front of the camera was still empty. I went back to the logbook and wrote, 10:34 p.m. camera shutter fired, chair unoccupied. At 10:51 p.m., a print slid into the second developing bath. I hadn't seen it come from anywhere. The bath was a closed tray, no feed mechanism, no enlarger pointed at it. But there it was, a sheet of 8 by 10 paper, face down, submerged in the developer, its edges just visible above the liquid line. Rule 4 said to let it complete its cycle. I stood at the edge of the bath and watched. Slowly, much more slowly than normal developer works, the paper began to darken. Not the image side, the back. The white paper stock itself turned from clean white to a dull ivory, then to a pale gray. After what felt like 4 or 5 minutes, the print floated gently to the surface and drifted toward the fixer bath, as though the liquid itself were carrying it. It settled into the fixer and stayed there. 3 minutes. I counted. Then I lifted it out with the tongs hanging beside the bath. The image was a photograph of the hallway I had just walked through, taken from the far end, looking toward the front counter. The sodium light from the parking lot was visible through the glass panel above the front door. Everything was exactly as it appeared now, in this building, tonight. Except that in the photograph, someone was sitting on the metal stool behind the counter, a figure slightly blurred, as though they had moved during a long exposure. The posture was familiar, the shape of the shoulders, the way the left hand rested on the counter. It was me, sitting exactly where I had been sitting 4 minutes ago when the camera fired. The camera was in the processing room. The processing room was behind a closed door at the end of the hallway. There was no line of sight between the camera and the front counter. I set the print on the drying rack, and I didn't touch the camera, and I went back to the logbook and wrote exactly what I had seen, because the rules told me to write clearly, and I have always been someone who follows instructions when he doesn't know what else to do. By 11:15 p.m., 2 more prints had appeared in the developing bath. I followed the same protocol, waited for them to complete the developer cycle, let them drift into the fixer on their own, counted 3 minutes, then examined them. The second print showed the chemical storage room. First door on the left, the one I'd opened during my walkthrough. The shelves were visible, the brown bottles, the plain white labels. Everything matched what I'd seen, but in the photograph, one of the bottles on the middle shelf was uncapped, and a thin line of dark liquid ran down the front of the shelf and pooled on the floor. I hadn't uncapped anything. I hadn't touched any of the bottles. I went back and checked the storage room. Every bottle was sealed. The floor was dry. The third print showed the filing room. The angle was from inside the room, looking toward the door, as if the camera had been standing where the center table was. The shelves were visible, the folders, the numbering system on the tabs. But the image included something I hadn't seen when I was in the room. A folder on the center table, open, with a photograph visible inside it. The photograph within the photograph was too small to make out clearly, but the folder's tab was facing the camera. I could read the number. It was 471-SH. The highest number I'd seen on the shelves had been somewhere in the 400s. I hadn't checked the exact last number, but 471 was plausible as a recent entry, or the next one, SH, my initials. My last name starts with H. My first name starts with S. I put the print on the drying rack with the others and went back to the front counter. I sat on the stool. I opened the logbook and recorded both prints, the times, the subjects, the details. I wrote clearly. I used the attached pen. I followed the rules. Then I turned back a few pages in the logbook and started reading earlier entries. Most were routine, dates going back weeks, different handwriting for each shift, equipment activations noted, prints produced and counted, departure times logged. The entries were clinical and brief, the way you'd expect from someone being paid to observe and document. But as I moved further back, I noticed patterns. One worker I could tell from the handwriting had logged 7 consecutive shifts. The first 3 entries were straightforward. Equipment on, prints collected, departure at 6 a.m. The 4th entry was longer. It read, 1:47 a.m. print in bath 3 appears to show the interior of my apartment. I do not understand how this is possible. The camera has not left the processing room. Proceeding with protocol. The 5th entry. Print at 2:20 a.m. shows my truck in the parking lot. Angle is from inside the building, looking through a wall that has no window. Image includes my lunchbox on the passenger seat, which is accurate. The 6th entry was only 1 line. The prints are not photographs. They are something else. I am continuing the shift. The 7th entry was a date, an arrival time and nothing else. No departure time, no notes, just the date and 10 p.m. After that, a new handwriting appeared. I counted the different handwritings in the logbook. There were at least 14. Some lasted a single shift. Some lasted as many as 9 or 10. None lasted more than 12. And each transition between one handwriting and the next followed the same pattern. The final entry from the outgoing worker was either incomplete or contained a single anomalous note. And then the new handwriting began on the very next line, as though the transition were seamless. No gaps, no blank pages, no position vacant notations. Someone always came next. I was the 15th handwriting, or possibly the 16th. 2 of the earlier entries were similar enough that I couldn't be certain they were different people. At 11:40 p.m., I heard the camera fire again. That heavy, mechanical clack. I noted the time, but didn't go into the processing room immediately. I sat with it for a moment, listening. The building was quiet, except for the low hum of the drying rack motor and a faint chemical gurgle from the baths. I thought about leaving. I want to be honest about that. I sat on that stool and thought about walking to my truck and driving back to my apartment and never coming back. But $19 an hour was more than I'd made in 5 months, and the woman on the phone had implied the pay was nightly cash at the end of each shift. I had a child support payment due in 6 days. I had a landlord who had been generous once and would not be generous again. The math was simple and cruel. 1 full shift was $152. 5 shifts was $760. That was rent. That was the support check. That was another month of being a person who met his obligations. So I stayed on the stool and I wrote the camera activation in the logbook and I waited. At 12:15 a.m., I decided to use the key and go back into the filing room. I wanted to check something. The room was exactly as I'd left it. Shelves, folders, standing table. But now there was a folder on the table. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of that. I'd locked the door behind me when I left, and the key hadn't left my pocket. But there it was, centered on the table, closed with its tab facing me, 471-SH. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of typed paper. No photograph yet. The sheet had the same format as the others. I'd checked a name line, a date range, and a series of numbers. My full legal name was on the name line. The date range showed today's date as the start. The end date was blank. The series of numbers matched nothing I recognized. And at the bottom, where every other file had read, processing complete, filed, this one read, processing initiated, sequence active. Below that, in smaller type, exposure count, 3. The camera had fired twice that I'd heard, 10:34 and 11:40. The print that had appeared in the bath at 10:51 made 3 exposures total, if each print corresponded to a shutter event. But I'd only heard 2. The third had been silent, or I hadn't been listening, or it had happened in a part of the building I couldn't hear from the counter. I put the folder back on the table exactly as I'd found it. I locked the filing room. I returned to the counter. At 12:30 a.m., the sound of running water began from behind the third door, on the left, the secondary darkroom. It started softly, like a faucet opened to a trickle, and then it grew. Not louder exactly, deeper. The sound developed a kind of body to it, a thickness, as though the water were running through something denser than pipes. It sounded like liquid moving through a living system, rhythmic, pressurized, almost organic. Rule 8 said this was part of the processing cycle. Rule 2 said not to enter this room between 12:30 and 3 a.m. I was standing in the hallway, close enough to touch the door, and the handle was cold again, colder than before, cold enough that I could feel it radiating from 6 inches away, the way you can feel a freezer door before you open it. I went back to the counter. At 12:47 a.m., the print conveyor activated. I heard the motor start a low, grinding hum, belt-driven, mechanical. Rule 6 said the conveyor might produce prints between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., and that I should collect them face down without looking at the image side. It was not yet 1 a.m. The conveyor was running early. I walked to the processing room and stood at the conveyor's output end. The belt was moving, but nothing was coming through. The slot at the input end was dark. The machine ran for approximately 90 seconds, then stopped. No print, just the sound, and then silence. I logged it. 12:47 a.m. conveyor activated. No output, duration approximately 90 seconds. At 1 a.m. exactly, it started again. This time, a print emerged. It came through the slot slowly, the belt pulling it at a steady rate, and it dropped into the output tray face up. I saw the image before I could look away. It was a photograph of a woman. She was sitting in the oak chair in front of the gray backdrop, the same chair in this room, the same backdrop on this wall. She was looking directly at the camera. Her expression was the same as every photograph in the filing room, neutral but specific, present but unposed, like she had been sitting there for a long time and had forgotten what her face was supposed to be doing. I didn't recognize her. But the photograph was recent. The paper was still damp, the image sharp and clean. The contrast balanced the way a properly processed print looks when it's freshly fixed. This wasn't an old image cycling through the machine. This had been made tonight, or very recently, in this room, with that camera, in that chair. The chair was empty. It had been empty all night. I turned the print face down and placed it in the output tray, the way the rules said. But I'd already seen it. I didn't know if that mattered. The rules said not to look at prints produced during this window. I hadn't looked deliberately. The print had come out face up, and my eyes were open, and I was standing right there. But the rule didn't distinguish between deliberate and accidental. It said, do not look, and I had. I went to the logbook. I wrote, 1 a.m. conveyor produced 1 print. Print was delivered face up. Image was viewed unintentionally, placed face down in output tray per Rule 6. I wrote it because I didn't know what else to do, and because the logbook felt like the one thing in the building that was mine. My handwriting, my record, the one part of this I controlled. Except I turned back a page, and there was a new entry below my last one. I hadn't written it. The handwriting was not mine. It was neat, small, and precise, and it read, 12:47 a.m. conveyor test cycle. Operator present. Exposure count updated 4. The count had been 3 when I checked the file at 12:15. Something between then and now had added a fourth exposure. The conveyor test maybe, or my presence in the processing room, or something I hadn't seen. And this entry that I had not written, in handwriting that was not mine, was in the logbook that Rule 10 told me never to alter. Every entry is permanent. I could not cross it out. I could not annotate it. I could only record that I had observed it. So I did. I wrote 1:09 a.m. entry observed at 12:47 a.m. timestamp in handwriting not matching mine. Noted per Rule 10. At 1:22 a.m., the conveyor produced a second print. This time I kept my eyes on the ceiling as it emerged and reached into the tray by feel, flipping it face down without looking. The paper was warm, not room temperature, not chemical bath temperature. Warm the way skin is warm. I placed it in the output tray and pulled my hand back and wiped my fingers on my jeans. At 1:38 a.m., a third print. At 1:51 a.m., a fourth. At 2:03 a.m., a fifth. I collected each one face down, eyes averted, and placed them in the output tray. The stack was growing. Each print was warm. Each one came through the conveyor at a steady mechanical pace, as though the machine were being fed from somewhere I couldn't see. At 2:14 a.m., the conveyor produced a print that was different. I knew it was different before I touched it, because the paper was heavier, thicker stock fiber-based, not resin-coated. The kind of paper you use for archival prints, the kind of paper that was in every folder in the filing room. I placed it face down with the others, but my hand lingered. The warmth from this one was more pronounced. It felt almost like it was pulsing a faint, slow rhythm, barely perceptible, the kind of thing you dismiss as your own heartbeat in your fingertips if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention. I was paying attention to everything. At 2:30 a.m., the sound from the secondary darkroom changed. The running water deepened further, and underneath it, I heard something new. Not a voice, not a mechanical sound, a slow, rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged across a wet surface. It lasted about 30 seconds, then stopped. The water continued. I stayed at the counter. Rule 8, part of the processing cycle. At 2:45 a.m., I opened the logbook to record the latest prints, and I found 2 more entries I hadn't written. They were in the same neat handwriting as before. The first read, 2:14 a.m. archival print produced, fiber base, sequence 471-SH, exposure count 9. The second read, 2:30 a.m. secondary processing room, rinse cycle complete, primary wash initiated, duration variable. 9 exposures. The count had been 4 at 12:47. In less than 2 hours, it had more than doubled. Each print from the conveyor must have been counting as an exposure, but there had only been 6 prints total, including the archival one. The math didn't work. There were exposures happening that I wasn't seeing, that the building was counting without my knowledge. I recorded the entries as observed. I didn't alter them. I was following the rules. I was doing exactly what the instructions said, and some part of me understood, with a clarity that felt less like intuition and more like reading a sentence I'd already seen, that following the rules was how the count was climbing. Every observation I logged, every print I collected, every time I walked the hallway, opened a door, stood in the processing room, the building was photographing me, not with the camera on the tripod or not only with it. The building itself was the camera. Every room was a lens. Every moment I was inside was an exposure. And the prints were the output, the developed images, the evidence that I had been seen by something that recorded light in a way I did not understand. At 3 a.m., the water sound from the secondary darkroom stopped. Silence. Complete and total. The kind of silence that has texture, that you can feel pressing against your eardrums. Rule 2's restricted window was over. I could enter that room now if I wanted to. I didn't want to. But I was beginning to understand that wanting had very little to do with what was happening in this building. I walked to the third door on the left. The handle was no longer cold. It was neutral room temperature, neither warm nor cool. I turned it and pushed. The secondary darkroom was small, maybe 8 by 8, A single processing tray sat on a counter against the back wall, filled with clear liquid. A clothesline-style drying wire was strung across the room at head height, with small clips hanging from it. The walls were painted matte black. There was no enlarger, no safe light, no timer, just the tray, the wire, and the walls. And on the drying wire, held by two clips, was a single print. I looked at it. It was a photograph of the filing room. The angle was from above, from the ceiling, looking straight down, as if a camera had been mounted in the light fixture. The center table was visible, the folder was open, and a figure was standing at the table, looking down into the folder. The figure was me. The timestamp in the corner of the print, I hadn't noticed timestamps on any of the other prints, but this one had one tiny. In the lower right read 12:15 a.m. The exact time I had entered the filing room and opened folder 471-SH. The building had photographed me reading my own file. Below the drying wire, on the counter next to the processing tray, was a second sheet of paper, not a print, a typed instruction, a single paragraph in the same font as the original rule sheet. It read, Rule 11. This room processes the final print in each sequence. The final print is always the last image the subject sees before their processing is complete. If you are reading this, you have entered the secondary darkroom after the restricted window. Your presence here is being documented. The final print in your sequence has not yet been produced. When it is complete, it will be hung on this wire. You will not be in the building when this happens. The building does not require your presence to complete your file. It requires only enough exposures to render the image with full clarity. Your current exposure count is being updated as you read this. I left the secondary darkroom. I closed the door. I walked to the front counter and I sat down, and I pressed my hands flat against the laminate surface because they were shaking and I needed them to stop. The logbook was open to my page. Below my last entry, in that same neat handwriting, was a new line. 3:07 a.m. Subject entered secondary processing room. Rule 11 delivered. Exposure count 14. It had been 9 at 2:14 a.m. It was 14 now. 5 additional exposures in less than an hour, and I hadn't heard the camera fire once during that time. The building didn't need the camera. The camera on the tripod was a prop, or a relic, or one input among dozens. The building was the camera. The walls were the shutter. The chemistry in those baths was the developer, and the filing room was the archive where the finished prints were stored permanently. I understood the system now. Not all of it, not the how, but the what. The building processed people the way a darkroom processes film. Exposure, development, fixing, filing. Every worker who came through that door was a roll of film being loaded into a camera. The shift was the exposure time. The prints were the proof sheets. And somewhere in that process, after enough exposures, enough data, enough light gathered from enough moments of presence, a final print was produced. The one that went in the file. The one that turned processing initiated into processing complete, filed. 470 people before me. 470 files. 470 final prints, and my count was at 14 and climbing. I looked at the clock on the wall behind the counter. It was 3:12 a.m. I had almost 3 hours left in my shift. Every minute I stayed was another exposure. Every room I entered was another angle. Every entry I wrote in the logbook was another moment of presence, documented and fixed. But the rules said my shift ended at 6 a.m., and the rules said not to remain past 6:15 a.m. And Rule 1, the very first rule, said that presence outside the shift window would be recorded as participation rather than observation. Observation was what I was being paid for. Participation was something else, something the building wanted. The conveyor started again at 3:20 a.m. I collected the print face down. It was warm. I didn't look at it. I placed it in the output tray and returned to the counter. At 3:33 a.m., another print. At 3:41 a.m., 2 prints in quick succession, the conveyor barely pausing between them. At 3:58 a.m., the camera on the tripod fired. I heard the shutter from the counter. This time, I didn't go check. I wrote the time and stayed where I was. At 4 a.m., Rule 6's restricted window ended. I was now permitted to examine any prints remaining in the output tray. There were 11 prints in the stack, including the archival weight fiber print from 2:14 a.m. I carried the stack to the processing room and laid them out on the counter beside the developing baths. Face up, one at a time. The first 7 were portraits, different people, different ages, different faces, all sitting in the oak chair, all looking at the camera with that same neutral specific expression. I didn't recognize any of them, but each print had a small number in the lower right corner, a file number, 089-WT, 153-PL, 244-JK, 301-EA. These were people from the archive, filed subjects, their final prints or copies of them being produced again, tonight, cycling through the machine as though the building were reviewing its own records. The 8th print was different. It showed the front counter, my stool from the same impossible angle as the first print of the evening, taken through a wall that had no window, from a camera that wasn't there. I was in the image, sitting on the stool, writing in the logbook. The timestamp read 1:09 a.m., the exact moment I had recorded the phantom entry. The 9th and 10th prints showed the hallway, empty, from 2 different angles. In one of them, the third door on the left, the secondary darkroom was slightly open. A thin line of light was visible through the gap. Not red safe light, not fluorescent. A pale, directionless glow, the kind of light that doesn't come from a bulb. The 11th print, the archival fiber-based print, was face down at the bottom of the stack. I turned it over. It was a portrait, a man sitting in the oak chair, looking at the camera. The expression was neutral, but specific, present, but unposed. The image was sharp, well exposed, properly developed, archival quality, ready to be filed. It was me. I was wearing the clothes I had on right now. The background was the gray backdrop on the processing room wall. The chair was the same oak chair, sitting 8 feet in front of the camera. The light overhead, the single light above the chair, was on in the photograph, casting a downward shadow across my shoulders. But I had never sat in that chair. I had never been in front of that camera. I had never posed for any photograph in this building. The light above the chair was off. It had been off all night. I looked at it now, a simple dome fixture, dark, no power running to it. Off. I looked at the photograph again. In the image, the light was on. In the image, I was sitting. In the image, my expression was exactly what every other subject's had been, the look of someone who had been there long enough to forget they were being watched. The logbook had a new entry when I returned to the counter. Neat handwriting, small and precise. 4:04 a.m. subject, reviewed output tray contents. Archival proof viewed. Exposure count, 22. Note, sufficient for preliminary render. Final render requires minimum 40. Sequence remains active, 40. The number was 40. 22 exposures in 6 hours. At this rate, 2 more full shifts would put me past the threshold. 2 more nights of sitting on this stool, collecting prints, writing in the logbook, following the rules. 2 more nights of earning $152 while the building gathered enough light to produce a final print that would go in a folder with my initials on the tab and a typed sheet that read, "Processing complete, filed." I could leave now, walk out, drive home, never come back. The shift didn't end until 6 a.m., but nothing was physically stopping me from standing up and going through that door, except the money, except the math, except the 6 days until the support check was due and the landlord who wouldn't wait, and the daughter who didn't know any of this was happening and didn't need to know, and except for Rule 1, which said that presence outside the shift window would be recorded as participation rather than observation, which meant that leaving early being present in the building before my shift ended might count differently than I thought, might add weight, might change the kind of exposure from passive to active, might accelerate the very thing I was trying to avoid. I didn't know. The rules didn't explain enough to know, and that was the design. That was how the building worked. It gave you just enough information to understand you were being processed, and not enough to understand how to stop it. I stayed until 6 a.m. I logged my departure. I put the pen down. I closed the logbook. I walked to the front door and stepped into the parking lot, where the sodium vapor light was still buzzing and the sky was turning gray-pink along the eastern horizon, and my truck was exactly where I'd left it. On the passenger seat was an envelope, Manila, my first name on the front. Inside was $152 in 20s and 10s, and a single strip of 120 format film, -6 frames, unexposed, still in its protective sleeve. I held it up to the dawn light. The frames were blank, clear, no images. But when I turned the sleeve over, there was a small sticker on the back. It read, 471-SH Exposure Reserve, 18 of 40 remaining. I put the envelope on the seat and drove home. I went back the next night. I went back because the math hadn't changed, because my daughter needed braces and her mother had already scheduled the consultation, and the first payment was due in 3 weeks, and I couldn't call her and say I'd quit a job over photographs that made themselves. I went back because the building paid cash, and the cash was real, and the landlord didn't care where it came from as long as it arrived on time. I went back because I told myself that knowing the system gave me power over it. That awareness was a kind of armor, that if I understood what was happening, I could control how much of myself I gave. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. The second night was quieter. I arrived at 9:48 p.m., waited in the parking lot until 9:55, and entered the building at 9:58. The manila envelope was on the counter again, my name on the front, the same typed instruction sheet inside. I didn't reread it. I knew the rules. I set the envelope aside and opened the logbook. My entries from the previous night were there. All of them, exactly as I'd written them. The phantom entries in the neat handwriting were there too, unchanged. But below my final departure note, there was a new entry I hadn't written. It read, 6 a.m., subject departed on schedule. Observation protocol maintained. No participation events logged. Exposure count at departure, 22. Sequence 471-SH remains within standard processing parameters. Standard processing parameters. As though there were a normal rate at which a person was supposed to be consumed by a building. I logged my arrival, 10 p.m. The drying rack started on its own. The second developing bath filled. Everything repeated. The same automated choreography as the night before. The building was running its program. At 10:20 p.m., I unlocked the filing room. I wanted to check my folder. It was on the table, same as before. I opened it. The typed sheet had been updated. The date range still showed the first night's date as the start. The end date still blank. But the exposure count now read 22. And below the processing initiated sequence active line, there was a new entry. Preliminary archival proof generated. Quality, sufficient for identification, insufficient for final render. Estimated remaining exposures for completion, 18. 18 more. The strip of negatives in the envelope had said the same thing, 18 of 40 remaining. The building was keeping count across every medium, the logbook, the file, the negative sleeve, the typed sheets. Every surface was a ledger. I closed the folder and left the room. I locked the door. I sat at the counter. That night, the conveyor produced 8 prints between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. I collected every one face down without looking. The camera fired 3 times, 11:15 p.m., 1:42 a.m., and 3:08 a.m. The secondary darkroom ran its water cycle from 12:30 to 3, same as before. The sound deep and organic and rhythmic behind the closed door. I didn't open it. I didn't enter any room I didn't need to enter. I moved through the building like a technician, efficient, minimal, contained. I was trying to reduce my exposure count, trying to give the building as little as possible. Fewer rooms entered, fewer moments of presence in the processing space, fewer angles for whatever invisible lens was mapping me. At 4 a.m., I checked the logbook. The phantom entries were there, neat and precise, logging every activation I'd noted and several I hadn't. The exposure count at the bottom of the page read 31, 31. I had started the night at 22, 9 new exposures in 6 hours, despite my deliberate minimalism. Despite staying at the counter, avoiding the processing room, not opening the secondary darkroom. 9 exposures just from being inside the building. The count wasn't tied to my actions. It was tied to my presence. Every minute inside the walls was light entering a lens. I couldn't reduce it by being careful. I could only reduce it by not being there. But not being there meant not getting paid. I checked the output tray at 4:01 a.m. 8 prints, face down. I turned them over. 6 were the same kind of archive portraits, filed subjects, recycled through the system, faces I didn't recognize. 2 were new. The first new print showed my apartment, not the outside, the inside. My kitchen, shot from an angle near the ceiling, looking down at the counter where I kept my keys and wallet. The image was dark, underexposed, grainy, like a surveillance photograph taken in low light, through a lens that wasn't designed for the space. But the details were accurate. The crack in the laminate near the sink, the coffee mug I'd left unwashed that morning, the child support calculation I'd scribbled on a napkin and left next to the phone. The second new print showed my daughter. Not here, not in this building. She was at her mother's house, sitting at a table, the dining room table I recognized from the 2 years I'd lived there, doing homework. The angle was from behind and above, looking over her right shoulder. Her handwriting was visible on the page. Math, long division. She was concentrating, her head tilted slightly to the left, the way she always did when she was working something out. The photograph was perfectly exposed, sharp, well-developed, archival quality. The building wasn't just photographing me, it was photographing my life, my spaces, my people. Everything connected to the subject of sequence 471-SH was being gathered into the file, the way a portrait photographer takes establishing shots before the final sitting. Context images, environmental details, the world surrounding the subject, building toward a complete record. I put the prints in the output tray face down. I logged my departure at 6 a.m. I drove home. The envelope on my passenger seat contained $152 and another strip of blank negatives. The sticker read, 471-SH, exposure reserve, 9 of 40 remaining, 9 more. After 2 nights, the building needed 9 more exposures to finish my file. 1 more full shift would probably be enough. 1 more night of sitting on that stool, breathing that chemical air, listening to the conveyor belt feed prints into the tray. 1 more night and the building would have its 40 exposures, and it would produce whatever a final render was, and it would hang it on the wire in the secondary darkroom, and it would place it in my folder, and it would type, processing complete, filed on the sheet, and I would become number 471, permanent, archived, done. I didn't go back that night. I didn't go back for 4 days. On the second day, I found a photograph under my apartment door. It was a print, 8x10, fiber-based, archival weight, showing the front counter of the building. The logbook was open. The stool was empty. The clock on the wall read 10 p.m. The timestamp in the corner read yesterday's date. The building had run its shift without me, and it had sent me proof. On the third day, there was another print under my door. This one showed the filing room. My folder was open on the table. The typed sheet was visible, though the text was too small to read in the photograph. But I could see the exposure count line, and although I couldn't make out the number, the line was longer than before, more digits. The count was still climbing. I hadn't been inside the building. I was 40 minutes away, in my apartment, with the door locked and the blinds drawn, and the exposure count was still climbing. The building didn't need me there. Just like Rule 11 had said, it didn't require my presence to complete my file. It required only enough exposures, and it was finding them without me. My apartment was a room it could photograph. My kitchen was a composition. My daughter was a subject. Every space I occupied was a darkroom the building could reach into and expose. On the fourth day, I called the phone number from the workforce board. The woman answered, same voice, same calm, procedural tone. "I'm not coming back," I said. There was a pause, not a surprised pause, a measured one, the kind of silence that has already calculated what comes next. "Your exposure count is at 37, she said. "You have 3 remaining. They'll complete whether or not you return. But if you return and sit for the final 3, you can choose the expression." "What?" "The final print is a portrait. Every subject gets one. If you're present for the last 3 exposures, you sit in the chair and the camera takes your photograph and you choose how you look. Your expression, your posture, the way you'll appear in the file permanently. If you're not present, the building composites the final image from the exposures it's already collected. 37 angles, 37 moments. It assembles them into a single portrait, and the expression is whatever the aggregate of those moments produces. Most people who don't return end up looking the way you'd expect, tired, confused, slightly afraid. That's their permanent image. That's what goes in the folder. And if I sit for it, then you look however you choose to look. Some people smile. Some people look directly at the lens with something that resembles control. It doesn't change the file. It doesn't change the fact of being filed, but it changes the photograph. And for some people, that matters. I hung up. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bed in my apartment, and I listened to the sounds of the building settling around me, the refrigerator compressor, the neighbor's television through the wall, the occasional car passing on the street below, and I thought about 470 folders on metal shelves, each one containing a photograph of a person who had once sat on that stool, or stood in that hallway, or collected prints from that conveyor belt. 470 people who had followed the rules or broken them, who had stayed for the money or left out of fear, who had been given the same choice I was being given now. I thought about the 7 handwritings in the logbook that had lasted more than 5 shifts. They had kept coming back. Night after night, they had driven to that building and sat on that stool and watched the prints develop and written in the logbook with the attached pen. They had done this knowing what was happening, knowing the count was rising, knowing the file was thickening. They had come back because the money was real, or because the routine was comforting, or because choosing to participate felt different from being processed without consent. Or maybe they had come back for the same reason the woman on the phone had described. Maybe they had come back to choose their expression. I found myself thinking about what I would want to look like. If there was going to be a photograph of me in a folder on a shelf in a building that processed people like film, what did I want my face to say? Did I want to look afraid? Did I want to look defiant? Did I want to look like a man who had been tricked into something he didn't understand, or like a man who had understood it completely and sat down anyway? On the 5th day, I drove back to Rogers County. I arrived at 9:50 p.m. I sat in the parking lot until 9:58. I walked to the door. It was unlocked. The building smelled the same, chemical, sweet, layered with age. The counter was clean. The logbook was open to a fresh page. The page before it, the page that should have been blank since I hadn't been there for 4 nights, was filled with entries in the neat handwriting. 4 nights of automated shifts, equipment activations, prints produced, exposure counts logged for sequence 471-SH. The final entry on that page read, exposure count 39, 1 remaining, awaiting subject return or composite authorization. I logged my arrival, 10 p.m. I walked down the hallway. I pushed through the heavy door into the processing room. The oak chair was where it had always been. The gray backdrop was on the wall. The camera was on its tripod. The film advance lever cocked, the lens uncapped and pointing at the chair. The single dome light above the chair was off. I walked to the chair. I stood behind it, my hands on the backrest. The wood was warm, not hot. Warm the way the prints had been. A low, patient warmth that felt less like heat and more like attention. I sat down. The light above me turned on, a soft, even glow that fell straight down, illuminating the chair and the backdrop and nothing else. The rest of the processing room dimmed around me, the developing baths and the drying rack and the conveyor fading into shadow, until the only visible space was the small circle of light I was sitting in. The camera was 8 feet in front of me. The lens was a dark circle, open and waiting. I couldn't see into it. I couldn't see what was behind it. I could only see the front element of the glass, which reflected the light above me, back at me in a small, bright point, like a single eye. I straightened my back. I put my hands on my knees. I looked directly at the lens. I thought about my daughter doing long division at her mother's dining room table, her head tilted to the left. I thought about the way she laughed when she was surprised, a short, sharp sound, almost a bark, that she'd gotten from me and not from her mother. I thought about the coffee mug on my kitchen counter, and the napkin with the support calculation, and the landlord who had been generous once. I thought about all the rooms I'd been in, all the angles the building had recorded, all the 39 exposures that had captured me, tired, confused, slightly afraid. I decided what my face would look like. The shutter fired, that heavy mechanical clack, one last time, filling the room and then emptying it. The light above me turned off. I stood up. I walked to the counter. I opened the logbook. Below my arrival entry, in the neat handwriting, was a final line. 10:07 p.m. exposure 40 of 40. Sequence 471-SH complete. Final render in process. Estimated development time 7 days. File will be available for permanent shelving upon completion. Subject is released from observation protocol. No further shifts required. I closed the logbook. I left the building. I drove home. 7 days later, a manila envelope was under my apartment door. No postmark, no return address. My name on the front, first name only, spelled correctly. Inside was a photograph, 8 by 10, fiber-based, archival weight. The paper was heavy and smooth and slightly warm, even after however long it had been sitting on my floor. It was a portrait of me sitting in the oak chair, looking directly at the camera. The exposure was perfect. The contrast was balanced. The gray backdrop was clean and even. The light fell straight down the way I remembered it, casting a soft shadow behind my shoulders. My expression was calm, not blank, not afraid, not resigned. Calm. The kind of calm that comes from making a single deliberate choice in a situation where every other choice has been made for you. I looked like a man who knew exactly where he was and had decided, in the last moment available to him, what that would mean. It was the best photograph anyone had ever taken of me, and I hated it because it was beautiful, and because it was true, and because I knew it was already in a folder on a shelf in a building in Rogers County, filed under 471-SH, permanent, and that nothing I did from this point forward would change it, or remove it, or make it less real than it was. I put the photograph in my closet, in the box where I keep my developing trays and my chemistry and my safe light. I put it face down, under the trays, where I wouldn't see it. 3 weeks later, I was developing a roll of film I'd shot of my daughter's school concert. Nothing unusual, just a personal roll, Tree X, processed in my apartment closet the way I'd done 100 times before. I unspooled the film in the dark, loaded it into the developing tank, ran it through the chemistry, hung it to dry. When I cut the negatives into strips and held them up to the light, there were 37 frames. I'd only shot 36. The 37th frame was at the end of the roll after the last exposure I remembered taking. I printed it. It was a photograph of a folder on a metal shelf. The tab was facing the camera. The number read 472-CF. The folder was thinner than the others around it. New, recently filed. And on the shelf below it, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a handwritten index card pinned to the shelf with a small brass tack. The card read, "Position open, overnight imaging monitor, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. No experience required." I don't know who CF is. I don't know if they've already started or if they're still sitting in their apartment, looking at a handwritten card on a workforce board, doing the math the way I did. I don't know if they'll last one shift or 12. I don't know what expression they'll choose. But I know their folder is ready, and the building is patient, and the chemistry works best in the dark. I still develop film. I still stand in my closet with the safe light on, and the trays laid out, and the smell of fixer in the air. But sometimes, when I'm watching an image surface in the developer, that slow emergence, the shadows first, then the midtones, then the highlights, the whole picture assembling itself out of nothing, I think about what it feels like from the other side, what it feels like to be the image, to be the thing that's developing, to feel yourself becoming visible, one detail at a time, in a tray you can't climb out of, under a light you didn't choose, in a room that has been waiting for you longer than you know. And I wonder if the photograph in my closet is still face down under the trays. I don't check. I haven't opened that box in months because I'm afraid that if I look, the expression will have changed, and I'm more afraid that it won't. If this story unsettled you, if you felt that slow, quiet dread building in your chest, the way a photograph develops in a tray, then you already know this channel is different. Drop a comment telling me which rule disturbed you most, or what you would have done on that second night. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story in this archive is already being processed, and you don't want to miss the moment it develops.